I still remember the sound of that door closing behind me that evening. It wasn't loud, not dramatic, just a soft click, but somehow it echoed through my bones like a final goodbye. The house was quiet, too quiet, and for the first time in my life, it didn't feel like home anymore. My son had left. My only child, the one I had raised with every bit of love I had, the one I had sacrificed everything for, had looked me in the eye and told me he couldn't take care of me anymore. He said the world had changed, that I was becoming a burden, that the old house was better for me than his fast city life. I didn't cry when he drove away. I couldn't. My heart felt too heavy for tears, my voice too empty for words. I just stood at the window and watched his car disappear down the road, the taillights flickering in the dark like dying stars. That night, I sat alone in the same living room where I used to celebrate his birthdays, where laughter once filled every corner. The walls now felt like strangers. The clock ticked, slow and cruel, reminding me of every second that I was left behind. I walked around the house, touching old photographs, feeling the dust on the frames, the memories trapped inside them. This house had been in our family for generations, built by my father's hands, filled with stories, laughter, even sorrow, but it had always been ours. And now it was just mine. My son said he'd visit. He said he'd call. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the phone stayed silent. The silence was louder than anything I'd ever known. Sometimes I sat by the porch, waiting for the sound of his car, convincing myself that maybe today he'd remember. Maybe today he'd come. But he never did. The loneliness became a companion, the kind that doesn't speak but sits quietly beside you, reminding you that you're still alive but not really living. I started talking to the house like it could hear me. Maybe it could. After all, it had heard everything else. I'd tell it about the rain, about how the garden still bloomed, even when I forgot to water it. I'd tell it about the dreams I used to have, about how proud I was when my son got his first job, and how much I missed the sound of his laughter echoing through the halls. One morning, while making tea, I caught sight of myself in the mirror above the sink. The woman staring back at me looked tired, older, but not defeated. I smiled faintly, realizing that maybe this was what life was trying to teach me, that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who break us, not out of cruelty, but out of selfishness, fear, or simply because they've forgotten what love really means. I didn't hate him. I couldn't. I just felt empty. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that this wasn't the end. Maybe, just maybe, this house still had a purpose. Maybe I still had a purpose. That night, a storm rolled in. The rain hit the windows like 1,000 tiny hands, and the thunder shook the ground. As I sat in the dim light of an old lamp, sipping cold tea, I thought about the life I'd lived and the one I had left. I had no idea that 6 months from that very night, this same house, the one my son called too old, too broken, too slow for the modern world, would become the very place where my life would change forever. But that night, I only knew one thing. I was alone. Truly, painfully, and completely alone. The days that followed blended together, slow and colorless, like a film running out of light. I woke up early every morning, out of habit more than purpose. Made tea for two, though there was no one else to drink it, and sat by the kitchen window watching the sun rise over the same trees my husband had planted years ago. It was peaceful, yes, but also painfully empty. Sometimes I heard footsteps in my head, my son's footsteps, the sound of him running down the hallway as a boy, calling me to see his drawings or help him fix his toy. Now that sound was replaced by the creaking of the old wood and the sighing of the wind through broken windows. I tried calling him a few times. The first few weeks he'd pick up, his voice rushed, distracted, like he had better places to be. "Mom, I'm busy right now. I'll call you later," he'd say. Later never came. Then, after a while, he stopped answering altogether. The silence on the other end of the line was louder than his voice ever was. I told myself he must be struggling, that life in the city was hard, that maybe he just needed space. I made excuses for him the way mothers always do, believing love was enough to fill the cracks. Until one day, when everything changed. I got a letter. Not from him, but from a lawyer. It said my son wanted to transfer the ownership of this house into his name. My hands trembled as I read those words. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Why would he need that? This house wasn't just property. It was our home, the only thing left from his father's memory. But as I read further, the truth became clear. He wasn't planning to keep it. He wanted to sell it. My heart sank. I felt betrayed in a way I didn't think was possible. I had given him everything, every bit of savings, every sacrifice, and now he wanted to sell the one thing that still held my life together. I called him that evening, my voice shaking, asking him why. There was a long pause before he spoke. "Mom, listen, the house is old. It's just sitting there. We could use the money for something better. Maybe I could invest. Maybe I could buy you an apartment closer to the city." His words were smooth, but they stung like salt in a wound. "This is your father's house," I said quietly. "He built it with his hands. You took your first steps here." He sighed, frustrated. "Mom, please, don't get sentimental. Times have changed. I can't keep paying taxes for a house that's falling apart. You should be happy. You'll get to live comfortably." "Comfortably?" I whispered. "Without my home?" He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the furniture, the cracks that held 1,000 stories. I knew he saw it as just wood and stone, but to me it was sacred, a piece of my life that couldn't be replaced. A few weeks later, a man came to visit, a real estate agent. My son had sent him. I stood at the door, my heart heavy, and told him I wasn't interested. He looked surprised, even uncomfortable, and left quietly. But the damage was done. My son called me that evening, furious. "Mom, why would you do that? You're making this harder than it needs to be." I tried to explain, but he didn't listen. The more I spoke, the colder he became, until his voice finally broke into a sentence I'll never forget. "Maybe you should just stay there then, in that house, all alone. Since you love it so much." The call ended. I stared at the phone, numb. I realized I had lost him not to distance, but to greed, to a world that taught him that love could be measured in money. The betrayal wasn't just that he wanted to sell the house. It was that he didn't see me anymore. I was no longer his mother, just another obstacle standing between him and what he wanted. For days after that, I barely spoke. I stopped calling. I stopped waiting. The silence grew heavier, but strangely, I began to find peace in it. I started cleaning the house, room by room, as if by caring for it, I could care for myself again. I repainted the walls, fixed the broken shelves, and tended to the garden that had been dying slowly under the weight of neglect. And as I worked, something unexpected happened. I began to heal. I realized that maybe the world hadn't taken everything from me. Maybe it had just pushed me back to where I was supposed to start again. But deep down, a tiny spark of hurt still burned quietly, and I didn't yet know that spark would soon light up my entire life in a way no one could have predicted. It was early spring when the first sign of change arrived. The air smelled different, lighter somehow, and the sunlight that spilled through the cracked window frames felt warmer on my skin. I had spent months in silence, learning how to live with my own thoughts, finding peace in small things, the kettle's whistle, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds that built nests near the porch. I had stopped expecting anything from anyone, especially from my son. But fate has a strange way of finding us when we least expect it. One morning, as I was sweeping the front steps, a car pulled up outside. It wasn't my son's. It was a black sedan, shiny and new, too modern for this quiet street. A man stepped out, middle-aged, well-dressed, carrying a leather folder. He smiled politely and asked, "Are you Mrs. Carter?" I nodded cautiously. He introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, a real estate developer. I felt my chest tighten, thinking maybe my son had sent him again. But he quickly explained he wasn't here to buy the house, at least not yet. He said he'd been passing through the area and noticed the old architecture. "This house," he said, "it's beautiful. Do you realize how rare it is to find something this well-built still standing?" I laughed softly, brushing dust from my apron. Beautiful isn't the word most people would use. It's old, stubborn, and full of secrets. He smiled. "Then it's perfect. I'm working with a company that restores old homes, turns them into heritage inns or community spaces. We're looking for locations just like this." His words felt like they were from another world. For months, I had only heard people call this place too old or worthless. Hearing someone call it beautiful again made my throat tighten. He asked if he could look around, and I agreed. As he walked through each room, he took notes, asked questions, admired the wooden beams and hand-carved doors. "Your husband must have been a craftsman," he said quietly. I nodded, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. He built it before our son was born. Every brick meant something. When he was done, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Mrs. Carter, I won't promise anything, but I think this property has potential. If you're open to it, I'd like to discuss a partnership, something that could bring this house back to life." A partnership. The word sounded strange in my ears. I wasn't a businesswoman. I was just an old mother living alone in a forgotten house. But Daniel's tone wasn't condescending. It was respectful, sincere. He gave me his card and told me to think about it. That night, I sat by the window, holding that card under the lamp's light. 100 doubts circled my mind. What if it was a scam? What if I lost the only thing I had left? But another voice whispered quietly, what if it was the second chance I never thought I'd get? The next morning, I called him. We met again, this time over coffee at a small diner in town. He explained everything carefully. His company wanted to restore the house as part of a local heritage project funded by investors who valued preservation. They didn't want to buy it, they wanted me to co-own it, to be part of its future. Your story, he said, is what gives this place its soul. Without you, it's just wood and stone. Those words touched something deep inside me. For years, I had been treated like a leftover piece of the past, a burden that no one wanted to carry. And now, suddenly, someone was telling me I mattered, that my memories, my history, were worth something. We agreed to move forward, slowly. He arranged for appraisers to visit, engineers to inspect the foundation, architects to sketch possibilities. For weeks, the house that had been silent began to hum with life again. Workers came and went, measuring, taking photos, whispering ideas. I watched from the porch, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Every corner they touched seemed to breathe again. One evening, Daniel brought a portfolio of designs. He showed me how the old house could become a heritage in keeping its heart intact while adding warmth and beauty. You'd have a share in everything, he said, from the profits to the recognition. And you could stay here, of course. It will always be your home. I couldn't speak for a while. Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from disbelief. 6 months ago, I was abandoned, forgotten, left to fade quietly into the past. And now, the very house my son called worthless was about to become something extraordinary. As I looked around the living room, filled with sketches and blueprints, I realized this house had never been my prison. It had been my shield, my second chance, waiting patiently for me to see its worth. I smiled softly and whispered to myself, maybe that's what love does. It breaks you so you can rebuild stronger. The days that followed were brighter than anything I'd seen in years. The house that had once been filled with silence now buzzed with the sounds of hammers, laughter, and life. The old walls, which used to echo only my footsteps, now carried voices of architects, workers, and designers discussing plans with passion. It was like the house itself was waking up after a long sleep. Every day, Daniel would visit to check on the progress, and sometimes we'd sit together on the porch, sharing tea and talking about life. He told me about his childhood, about his love for history and the beauty of old things. He said that restoring homes like mine was his way of giving lost stories another chance to be heard. His kindness reminded me of the gentleness I used to know in my husband, the quiet strength of someone who built instead of destroyed. Slowly, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: pride. The workers treated me with respect, calling me ma'am and asking for my opinion. They said things like, "You've kept this house strong all these years. You've done what most couldn't." Those words warmed me more than the morning sun ever could. Sometimes I'd walk through the half-finished rooms and think of my son. I'd imagine him standing here, seeing the transformation, realizing what he almost threw away. I wondered if he'd feel regret or shame or maybe even pride that his mother had done something he never believed she could. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted peace. But fate, as always, had its own plans. One afternoon, as the project neared completion, Daniel approached me with a smile that couldn't hide his excitement. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "we have news. A major investor saw the proposal and wants to feature your house in a national campaign for heritage restoration. They're offering a full partnership deal worth over $1 million. I froze. The number echoed in my ears like a whisper I couldn't believe. $1 million? I repeated, my voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes shining. You'll own a large share, and the rest will go toward maintaining and expanding the property. It's not just about money, it's about recognition. You're going to be part of something beautiful." My hands shook as I tried to process it. 6 months ago, I couldn't even afford to fix a broken window, and now the same walls that once made me feel trapped were about to change my life forever. I didn't cry right away. I just sat quietly, letting it sink in. Later that night, when the stars came out, I walked through the garden and whispered a thank you to my husband's memory. I felt like he was watching, smiling, proud that I hadn't given up. The house glowed softly under the moonlight, its windows reflecting the light like eyes filled with life again. But as the news spread through the town, it eventually reached someone I hadn't expected: my son. It started with a phone call. I was sitting in the living room, going through some documents, when my phone rang. His name flashed on the screen. For a moment, I didn't know whether to answer. My heart raced. I hadn't heard his voice in months. Finally, I picked up. "Mom?" His voice was hesitant, softer than I remembered. "I heard about the house." I said nothing, just waited. "$1 million deal?" He continued, trying to sound casual, but I could hear the disbelief hiding behind his tone. "That's incredible." I smiled faintly. Yes, the house turned out to be more valuable than we both thought. There was a long pause. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said finally. "I just thought you'd be better off if—" I cut him off gently. "You thought money could replace meaning." "I understand." He didn't reply. I could hear him breathing on the other end, the same rhythm I used to listen to when he was a baby, sleeping peacefully in his crib. For a second, I felt that old ache, the longing to hold him, to tell him it was okay. But this time, I stayed silent, letting him sit with his own thoughts. "Can I visit?" he asked quietly. I hesitated, then said, "You can. But come as a guest, not as someone who once left. The house deserves respect now." When he arrived 2 days later, he stood by the gate for a long time, staring at what the house had become. The walls gleamed freshly painted, the porch was restored, and flowers bloomed in every corner. He looked around in awe. "I can't believe this is the same place," he whispered. I looked at him and smiled gently. "It always had potential. You just couldn't see it." He lowered his head, guilt flickering in his eyes. Inside, as he walked through the rooms, he touched the polished banisters, the new flooring, the shining windows, and I could see realization dawning on him. The house he had once abandoned now stood stronger than ever, just like the mother he left behind. We sat together for tea, the same way we used to, only this time. The silence between us wasn't filled with anger, but with lessons learned. I didn't scold him. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence can teach what words never could. The day the deal was officially signed felt like a dream. The house was now a heritage landmark, a living memory of everything I had endured and everything I had become. Reporters came to take pictures. Local newspapers wrote stories about the old woman who turned history into hope, and people who once pitied me now looked at me with admiration. But for me, the real victory wasn't the money or the attention. It was the quiet strength that had carried me here, the same strength that had once been mistaken for weakness. My son was still staying at the house that week, helping out with last-minute preparations before the inauguration. I could tell he was struggling to find the right words. Every time he looked at me, his eyes softened, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. One evening, after the workers had left and the house was calm again, he finally spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't deserve your kindness. I don't even know how to ask for your forgiveness." I looked at him, really looked at him, the boy I once carried, the man who had lost his way, and the son who had finally come back. "Forgiveness," I said gently, "isn't something you ask for once and receive. It's something you earn slowly by learning and changing." His eyes filled with tears. "I was selfish," he admitted. "I thought success meant forgetting where I came from. I thought old things had no value. But I was wrong. This house, you were the foundation of everything good in me, and I threw it away." My heart ached, but not with anger, with understanding. We sat there in silence for a while, listening to the creak of the house, the sound of rain beginning to fall outside. "You know," I said finally, "this house was never old. It was just waiting for someone to care again. Maybe people are like that too?" He smiled faintly, wiping his tears. "You've built something beautiful here, Mom. I'm proud of you." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "No, son. I didn't build this. Life did, pain did. And love, the kind that doesn't fade even when it's forgotten for a while." The next morning was the inauguration. Daniel stood beside me as we cut the ribbon, cameras flashing, people cheering. My son stood a few steps behind, watching with an expression I couldn't quite describe, something between pride and remorse. When the ceremony ended, he came to me and said, "I want to help, Mom. I want to be part of this. Not for money, not for recognition, just to give back what I took." I placed my hand on his. "Then start by staying. Not because you owe me, but because you belong here." Over the next few weeks, he did stay. He worked with Daniel, helping with the operations, learning about restoration, about patience, about legacy. I could see the boy I once knew returning, piece by piece. There were still moments of awkwardness, but also laughter, shared meals, and new memories forming in the same rooms that once held our pain. One evening, months later, I stood by the window watching the sun set over the garden, now full of flowers and life. My son joined me quietly. "Do you ever think about how things could have been different?" he asked. I nodded. "All the time. But then I realize if things hadn't fallen apart, we might never have learned to rebuild." He smiled softly. "I guess sometimes losing everything shows you what truly matters." I turned to him and said, "That's the thing about homes and hearts. They break so they can grow bigger." He looked at me, eyes warm, and said, "I love you, Mom." My throat tightened. "I love you too, son." And for the first time in a long time, I believed those words completely. That night, as I walked through the quiet halls, I ran my hand along the walls that had witnessed it all: love, loss, betrayal, and rebirth. I realized that this house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was a mirror of my soul, cracked but never broken, scarred but still standing. I smiled and whispered into the air, "We did it." The lights glowed softly around me, and I could almost feel the house breathe, alive once again. Sometimes life doesn't give us the ending we hope for, it gives us the one we need. My son left me once in this old house, thinking it was the end of my story. But he was wrong. It was just the beginning. Because sometimes when everything and everyone leaves, what remains isn't emptiness, it's strength waiting quietly to be found.